This is the story of our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Today, I will share with you a uniquely American story as we use history as a guidepost to propel us forward. And it begins here. This is Senator John Albers. A few years ago, I was right here at the Georgia State Capitol and needed to leave to get up to my district to speak to a group of Boy Scouts to help them out with their merit badges. I left the Georgia Capitol to drive up to the church where the Boy Scouts were meeting. Atlanta traffic wasn't that favorable that day, so when I arrived, I quickly tossed my suit coat in the back of my car and walked over to a group of boys who were learning how to fold an American flag. 4 boys, one in each corner, began to shake the flag and fold it in half for the first time. As they shook the flag the second time to fold it in half again, I watched in slow motion as the flag was about to fall out of their hands. And at that moment, I dove to the ground, a full Superman dive onto the asphalt to catch the flag. As I looked down, I saw my crisp white shirt had a tear in it, and some small dark red beads of blood had formed. I looked up at the boys' faces, and it was priceless. Finally, one of them said, "Mr. Albers, are you okay?" I smiled. I said, "I'm fine, boys." I got up and we finished folding the flag. I said, "Do you know why I dove down to catch the flag?" And they all shook their heads no. So we walked over, I sat them down in the grass and said, "Let me tell you a uniquely American story about some of our earliest veterans and why we never let the flag touch the ground." Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. It was September 1814, what we would later call the War of 1812. At that time, the British were back after the Revolution, and they wanted vengeance. They were going to put the American colonies back under their rule. At that time, they'd already burned Washington, D.C. They had pillaged our countryside and shattered our defenses. The American experiment seemed to be coming to a sudden end. The last bastion of American supplies and military power was in Fort McHenry in the port of Baltimore. There, the British held prisoners, as did the Americans. President James Madison dispatched a young attorney, Francis Scott Key, to go out and meet with the British to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Francis Scott Key rowed out to a large British ship and met with the admiral. And after the discussions were completed, they agreed on a 1-for-1 prisoner swap. At that time, he was allowed to go down into the belly of the ship and to meet with those who were held captive. And what he saw was some of the worst of humanity. Men chained to the boat, living in their own filth, starving. But when he told them they would be freed, they were excited and ready to rejoin the fight, to make sure America would go on and liberty and freedom would be the name of the day. He walked back up to the top of the ship to meet with the admiral so they could discuss the logistics for the transfer. The admiral said, "We'll still honor our agreement, but tomorrow the war will be over and this won't be an issue. All these men will be freed anyway." Francis Scott Key didn't understand. He asked the admiral, "Why would that happen?" And the admiral pointed to the east. He said, "Look out there." Francis Scott Key saw a few dots, then dozens, and then hundreds. The admiral said, "That's the entire British naval fleet, the largest and most powerful in the world. And they're coming here to this harbor, and they're going to blow that fort off of the planet." Francis Scott Key said to the admiral, "You can't do that. You don't understand. That fort is primarily used as a refuge for women and children and supplies." The admiral shook his head. He said, "I understand, and we've given them an out. We sent them a note that said at any time, if they will take down that flag, you see that ridiculous Star-Spangled Banner on that rampart over there, if they will simply lower that flag, we will stop all the shelling, and we will take their surrender, and the war will be over." Francis Scott Key was devastated. He went back into the belly of the ship to tell the men what was happening. The men said, "Well, tell us what's going on during the battle." So when Francis Scott Key got to the top of the ship, he found one of the grates in the middle of those old battleships that he could shout down to the men below. And when all those big ships came into the harbor and they anchored with their big guns, they were just far enough away that they could reach the fort. But the guns at Fort McHenry could not reach them. And when the hour became dark, they began shelling at what still today is considered to be one of the absolute worst bombardments in the history of the world. Shell after shell into the fort. Francis Scott Key would yell down to the men to give him an update, but it was dark and they couldn't see, except for occasionally one of the bombs would burst in air and the rockets would red glare and gleam. And at that moment, they'd see a glimpse of the flag. It was proof that the flag was still there. Francis Scott Key would go back over to the grate and shout down to the men, and they would hail in joy that our flag was still there. But it kept going and going for hours. Finally, the admiral walked over to Francis Scott Key, frustrated and upset. He said, "What is wrong with you people? Don't you know we're going to win the war?" Francis Scott Key, who was a rather mild-mannered gentleman, stood up straight and looked the admiral in the eye. He said in the words of General and President George Washington, "What separates the American Christian from all other men on earth is we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." The admiral then signaled to all the other ships to focus their guns exclusively on the rampart and that flag. And they began to shell nonstop. And then the shelling finally stopped. Everything was quiet. Francis Scott Key yelled down to the men at the belly of the ship and told them what had happened. And the men prayed. They said, "Lord, please keep that flag where we had last seen it. Lord, please protect our young nation. Lord, please let liberty and freedom win this war." As dawn approached and the sun rose from the east, Francis Scott Key borrowed a small telescope from one of the British officers. He held it tight in his eye, and as the sun hit the back, he followed it along the waterline. And from the waterline to the fort, and from the fort up to the rampart. And when they got to the top of the rampart, he saw it. Our flag was still there. The British knew they had lost. A couple months later, a peace treaty was signed, and the American experiment, the United States, would continue on. Francis Scott Key, concerned, jumped in a boat, raced over to the fort, jumped out into the water, threw open the doors of the fort, and what he found was pure destruction. They had been shelled time and time again and had over 1,000 barrels of gunpowder, but not one had been hit, which would have surely destroyed that fort. He went over to the rampart where people were still dazed and confused, and they told him what had happened. The rampart had been hit time and time again, and when it started to fall, the men, who surely knew they would perish, came out and held up that rampart humanly. And when they died, others came and took their place and also died. That rampart was being held up with the bodies of patriots. They did take down the flag at one point during the middle of the night because they had a smaller storm flag, and they raised up the larger flag to make sure the British would know it was still there. I turned and I looked at the boys who were sitting in the grass attentively learning the story. And I said, that is why we never let the flag touch the ground. The United States of America is the beacon of liberty and freedom for the entire world. And it is because of all of those who served, and incumbent upon each one of us in every generation to preserve and protect and defend it. So this flag, our flag, will always be there. May the Lord continue to watch over all of those who serve us in uniform, and may God bless America.